And I work for the Rogers Memorial Library, and on behalf of all of us at the library, thank you for being here for this second evening of our World War II Remembered Talking History programs. Tonight we're very fortunate to have with us three women who were nurses during World War II. But before I introduce them, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library for their funding for so many of our programs, and to invite all of you to take the opportunity to join the Friends of the Library tonight. You may do so after the program when we have refreshments. There are little membership cards on the table. Please join us for a few minutes after the program. I also should say that we had a fourth guest who was going to be here this evening with us, and we're very sorry that she's ill. Her name is Charlotte Jenkins. She was the only person who was not a nurse. She was in the Navy intelligence, doing Navy intelligence work, so that we're sorry that she's not here, but we're very happy to have a strong showing of nurses. In addition to the enormous response by American men to register for service during World War II, there was an equal, if not as generally well-known, response to the war effort made by hundreds of thousands of American women, who not only took over many of the civilian jobs previously held by men, but who also volunteered for service in all branches of the armed services. After several years of intense lobbying by women, on July 30th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed a bill which allowed all three branches of the military to recruit women. From then on, women Air Force service pilots ferried planes to military bases. WACs took over many of the Army jobs previously done by men. The Coast Guard and Marines recruited women from waves. Women served as correspondents and photojournalists and volunteered with Red Cross units throughout Europe, North Africa, and in the Pacific. No single group of women, however, answered the call for service in greater numbers or with more dedication than nurses. In 1942, an astounding 43% of all civilian nurses volunteered for the Army Nurse Corps. And unlike their sisters who had to struggle to be accepted into the military, it was understood from the outset that nurses were needed to care for the hundreds of thousands of men who would be wounded during the war years. Over the years, countless books have been written about the experiences of brave American men who served our country during World War II, but very few books have chronicled the experiences of the thousands of women who served their country as nurses, working under appalling conditions with dedication, compassion, and heroism in equal measure to their male colleagues. This evening, we are very grateful that three of them are here to tell us their own stories, and I'd like to introduce them to you. Next to me is Anne Santacroce, a Sag Harbor resident and former Army nurse who received her training in Brooklyn and enlisted in the Army in September of 1943. You'll hear about her wartime experiences in her own words, so I won't go into that. But after the war, she moved to Southampton. Actually, I believe in 1949 you moved back. She worked as a nurse in the OR at Southampton Hospital for a while, then married and raised 4 children with her husband, Frank. She later worked for a while for Doctors Peyton and Bronson until 1979 when she retired. She and her husband have been very active in the American Legion in Sag Harbor, and we are very grateful to her for being here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Anne. Next to Anne is Betsy Daniels. who likes hats.
I was told if I didn't wear one tonight, nobody would know me.
Bessie is a Sag Harbor native who served during the war as a nurse in the United States Navy. She attended Georgetown University Hospital for her nursing training and stayed on staff there until October of 1942, when she volunteered for duty in the Navy Nurse Corps. She began her wartime nursing duties, which eventually took her all over the world for 22 years of active duty. On her retirement in 1969, Betsy Daniels was married to Walter Daniels, who has since died, actually in 1988, and she has a stepson who lives in Mauritius. Please join me in welcoming Betsy Daniels. I should say that Betsy also has been very active in the American Legion in Sag Harbor. That's how I found these fine women. Yeah. Our last guest is Dolores Zabrowski, the daughter of a career naval officer and the great-grandchild of a Civil War veteran. She graduated from Sag Harbor High School and attended what was then the Southampton Hospital School of Nursing, graduating in 1943. She, along with 5 other nurses from the school, joined the Army as a nurse and spent the war years as a trained nurse, part of the time, yeah, which she will tell you about in a few minutes. After the war, she took advantage, I believe she took advantage of the GI Bill to go back to school and obtain a master's in nursing, and later worked in California, Brooklyn, and Charleston before returning to Sag Harbor in 1955 to teach nursing at the Southampton Nursing School. In 1966, she became the director of nursing at Southampton Hospital and the director of the School of Nursing, which subsequently closed in 1968. And she remained the director of nursing for the hospital until she retired in 1986. I hope I have these dates right. Over the years, Dolores has been active in the American Legion. She serves on the board of directors of Southampton Hospital and has been very active in community affairs in Sag Harbor. She has been working on a military history of Sag Harbor, and in fact, 4 people from Dolores's post recently went down to Washington, D.C., if I remember correctly, for the dedication of the Women's War Memorial. Please welcome Dolores Zabrowski. I'd like to begin by seeing if each of you can tell us a little bit about what you were doing in your lives before Pearl Harbor was attacked. Not when it was attacked, but I mean generally to tell us, were you in training, were you working, etc. How about you, Anne?
I was already graduated from training, and I was working in an operating room at our hospital at the time.
At which hospital?
Prospect Heights in Brooklyn.
Okay.
And I worked there until I went into the service.
Okay. And how about you, Betsy?
I was a graduate of Georgetown, and I was working on the staff at Georgetown and lived right outside of Washington, D.C. And until we heard the day.
We're just going to set the stage a little bit, and then I'll ask you about the big day there. How about you,
I was
Dolores?
in training at Southampton Hospital.
Okay.
And lived in Sag Harbor. You know, lived at the residence, but also lived in Sag Harbor, and it was just a wonderful time during those years.
Okay. Dolores is the sister of the late Dr. Mulvihill, the dentist. I think actually that Harry Martin, who's right over there, met Dr. Mulvihill coming back on a ship from the Pacific.
Right. Yes,
Isn't that
that's true.
amazing?
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Small world department, yeah.
Small world. Had any of you given much thought to Hitler's movements in Europe, and did you think the United States would become involved in the war at that time?
I was in high school. I didn't know, well, we read about it, but I certainly didn't give it very much thought.
Right.
I think the same with us. We're so busy leading our own lives and having fun. We just sort of heard about the war in Europe, but it didn't mean that much to us.
It seemed so far away that we wouldn't get involved with it.
Right.
It was just something we read about in the paper or heard on the news and the radios at the time.
So you didn't, I take it, have any strong feelings about being involved or not being involved?
No, I don't.
No.
Can each of you tell us what you were doing on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, starting with you?
Well, it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was working, or I was on call in the operating room when I heard about the attack at Pearl Harbor. And naturally, we were alerted to be prepared for anything that might happen, which thankfully nothing did happen at the time.
In terms of being attacked, having something happen here?
Happen here in this country, yes.
Did you hear it on the radio?
Yes. Yeah.
How about you, Betsy?
Oh,
I lived in an apartment right outside of Washington, D.C., and since we were going to have, my roommate and I were going to have company for dinner, I was vacuuming and cleaning, and because I was doing that, I couldn't have the radio on. In that apartment, you couldn't have two things like that on.
I see.
And when my roommate came home, she said, "Do you hear what was going on?" I said, I've been cleaning. I said, "The house looks nice, doesn't it?" And she told me.
So it was a big shock. How about you, Dolores?
I was in training at Southampton, and when we heard it, most people had never heard of Pearl Harbor. They didn't know where it was. I happened to have an uncle, Bud Sterling, who was stationed at Pearl Harbor on a submarine, so naturally we were all very concerned because I did have not a great idea where it was, but I knew, well, it's near Hawaii somewhere.
Right.
But that changed everybody's, that's all everybody talked about. The next
It's such a familiar place
right.
to us now, but I've heard this from several people that Pearl Harbor was nothing,
Right.
I mean,
No.
it was not in people's consciousness, that's for sure. Did your uncle survive?
Yes, he did
attack?
survive, yes.
That's good. Did any of you have siblings, older siblings, or relatives who were in any branch of the armed services? Who signed up?
Two younger brothers.
Two younger
In the
brothers?
service, yes.
I had a younger brother also.
And I had two brothers and my father,
They were
all in. Yeah.
What made each of you decide to join, to volunteer?
Well, they emphasized in the papers and the radio that they needed nurses. So I waited a while because I figured I had two brothers already in the service and I'd have to break the news to my parents that I wanted to go also. Then I finally did. I went into the service and they accepted it. They felt that was something I wanted to do. And they realized the need for nurses also.
I was just astounded by this figure of 43% of civilian nurses. You know, I mean, many men, of course, volunteered, but also many were drafted, whereas nurses really, you know, percentage-wise, they were volunteering in greater numbers, probably. How about you, Betsy?
Well, I was on the staff at Georgetown. I had graduated. This was the 4th year since graduation, and I just felt that I needed a change. So I decided to stay in the Navy. It was time for me to move on. So I went in the reserves and got called in November of '42.
Okay, so December 4th, so just almost a year after Pearl Harbor. And how about you, Dolores?
Well, when we were in training, as part of our training, we did special work in city hospitals. I would go for 3 months for psychiatry or children, and we'd meet nurses from all over the New York State. And gradually, every day a card would come, and one of them would have joined the Army. So and then the people who were at Southampton would be leaving to join the Army. And probably the biggest influence was my father, who I think was ahead of his time, because he kept after me, telling me it was my responsibility to go in the service, that my brothers were in, and that I just had as much responsibility as they did. So probably the influence of him.
In one of the books I was reading, one of the parents was quoted as saying, you know, I was expecting to have to say goodbye to my son, but I certainly wasn't prepared to have a daughter leave. And actually, you know, there was a comment that, you know, worried about women being on the front lines. Well, nurses certainly were, you know, right in the thick of it, many of you. We were also talking the other day, I think one of you made the comment that unlike men, many men ended up doing whatever job they were assigned to do. I think one of you made the point that for women who happen to be nurses, this was their work of choice.
Yes.
So, were nurses commissioned?
Yes.
Yes.
I think that was interesting. One of you was...
We were commissioned as second lieutenants when we went in.
Why was that?
What?
Why did they commission you?
Because we were RNs, and we already had our degree.
Educational.
At the beginning, though, the male nurses were not commissioned. And so women, the women nurses were commissioned, but the men were not. And so sometimes you'd be serving with male nurses. They might be sergeants or something like that. That changed after a while.
Did they have the same education?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I understand that there were no... In one of the books I was reading, it was mentioned that it was very hard for women physicians. And in fact, there were a couple who really struggled to be, taken seriously and serving overseas, but in fact, there were actually no female physicians serving in hospital units in battle areas.
I don't think I ever saw
Isn't
one.
that?
I don't think I did either.
Yeah, there weren't very many. Let me ask you also, I know the Army was segregated, was it not?
Yes.
Yes. How about nursing? I mean, were there black nurses working with black units of wounded people?
We had no segregation on
No
the ship.
segregation.
No.
And once people were wounded, were blacks and whites treated in the same facilities?
Yes.
I want to know a little bit about what kind of basic training each of you received. Can you tell us that?
Oh, we went on our hikes and we climbed ladders and we went under fences and
Was it very strenuous?
well, you're young and it didn't seem strenuous at the time. It's all relative,
Right.
you know.
And about how long did your training last?
I think, well, we did that all the while that we were being prepared to go overseas, which might have been 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay, and how about you?
I think I was at Fort Dix for about 6 weeks, and we also had, first they teach you Army protocol, and then how to march, how to salute, and then they'd have a drill for gas masks, and so I figured I could see all the fellows laughing, so I thought they're just fooling us. We're just going to go walk, put your gas mask on, go in this building, and it isn't, it's just a fake. So I lifted my gas mask up, and believe me, it was no fake. Also map reading, because we didn't know where we would be going. That would be the one thing. You see, all of us went in, and you had to go where you were assigned. So that was.
When you say map reading,
yeah,
what do you mean map reading?
Well, they had classes in how to read maps. What was north, south, east, and west. It was quite an interesting class. I never had any need for it, but I remember that was one of the classes.
Did they show you maps of Europe and maps of the South Pacific? And how about you, Betsy?
Well, when I got to Bethesda, the Naval Hospital at Bethesda, we had classes, also that big thing out in the water was not a boat; it was a ship.
Yeah, I made that mistake the other day of calling that a boat.
And we were told what was fore and aft and port and starboard. We had a chief whose greatest joy in this world was to instruct the nurses. He thought that was one of his real fun things. So he told us the four rules of getting along in the Navy. Now, I learned this in 1942, and I still remember it. Keep your mouth shut, your bowels open, salute your captain, and never volunteer for anything.
That's great. That's great. Oh, that's great.
You know how you volunteer, the captain would say, I need volunteers. You.
Yeah, exactly.
What kind of training did medics, and was it corpsmen in the Navy?
They
Corpsmen?
had schools.
They went to schools.
Yes.
Did nurses train medics?
Well, you worked with them right beside them, and you taught them as you went along. It was
They
an
learned on the
ongoing
job.
thing
Right.
to teach them.
Yeah, they had some training before time, but they were very eager to learn. Very alert young men.
Before we talk a little bit about your experiences anymore, can you tell us what is a hospital unit? Because two of you at least were assigned to hospital units, were you not?
The ship was a... Yeah.
Well,
All right, in the Army,
Yeah.
in Europe, for instance.
well, we had our commanding officer, and there must have been a provost, and I would say maybe about 15 or 20 other officers that had other responsibilities, and surgeons. They weren't all doctors, and then we had surgeons there. And the nurses, we had a chief nurse and her assistant, and just general duty nurses that did everything that had to be done.
And would your facility be likely to be a tent or a Quonset hut or what?
Well,
What kind of?
we were in Quonset huts at first when we went overseas. Then we were in tent units, and it varied to the location that we were at.
In one of the books, this book, No Time for Fear, is such a wonderful book. We're all going to buy it. It was written by a friend of Betsy's, and it's memoirs written by nurses, and they mention moving time after time after time in really, bad conditions and wet and cold and all that. Very often, I didn't realize this, people were quite mobile, were they not?
Yes, they were.
Of course, I guess that would make sense. I just hadn't thought of it that way.
And the entire unit would go on to the next post. It wouldn't be any one individual. It would be the entire unit.
The entire unit stayed together.
Yes.
Now, I think one of you mentioned to me that sometimes if a hospital were big enough, say in New York City, like Roosevelt Hospital, you would have an entire unit going from that hospital. Is that correct?
Yes.
I hadn't known that.
Well, when we were, excuse me, I was in England, south of Liverpool. This was before, and my surgical unit, which consisted of 2 surgeons, an anesthetist, a nurse, and 4 or 5 corpsmen, we were sent down to Southampton in England, and we realized after, because they were getting ready for the invasion, and we, as a surgical unit, we went down there to be there when they invaded D-Day.
Barton Stacy?
Pardon me?
Were you with Barton Stacy at
No.
Southampton?
No. At, I think the hospital was St. Swithin's, which is outside of London.
And did you travel on the Queen Mary?
Yes.
Going over?
Yes.
Can we just take a little bit of time now and hear about your travels and what you did?
Well, first place, I was seasick all the way over. But at night, everybody would collect in the grand ballroom, and there was always somebody to play a piano, and they would play all the patriotic songs, I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, or We're Coming Over, and all the patriotic songs. Give my regards to Broadway. And everybody was very jovial, singing, and it was very good for the morale for everybody to be in there doing that.
All right, so let's hear about what happened once you got over there. Can you just tell us your movements during the war?
When we arrived in Scotland, there was a tape of Churchill welcoming us to the area, and they had men playing the bagpipes, welcoming us, marching up and down. And from the ship, we went to on a train that took us down to the first hospital that we set up down in Blandford, I think the name of the town was. And we stayed there for a while and set up a hospital unit in there.
Do you want me to read this little greeting?
Yes.
So this is being broadcast over all
Yes,
the loudspeakers.
over a loudspeaker.
Welcome to each American soldier who has left home to join the great forces now gathering in this island. I send a message of greeting and welcome. Wherever you may go in our country, you will be among friends. Our fighting men look upon you as comrades and brothers in arms. Welcome to you while you are with us, and when the time comes, we will all go forward together and carry the good cause to final victory. Winston Churchill. Sounded like he was talking to men, not women, didn't
Yes. All those days they did.
They did, didn't they? Okay. So, okay. You want to continue then?
Well, as I say, from there I went down with the surgical unit to Southampton, where we were preparing for D-Day, and I think I stayed down there about 2 months. In the morning of D-Day, we knew something was going on. We heard all these planes going over, and a short while later, they started bringing the casualties in, and there were a lot of very sick, hurt people coming in.
Was that your first experience with
Severely wounded. Now, we had some back in the other hospital, but these were the most severe. Yes.
One of the women, actually quite a few people who've written in these memoirs, mentioned that they had a patient that they were never able to forget, or their first patient they were never able to forget. Did you have that kind of an experience? Were there
Yes.
people who were so special to you?
One young boy, couldn't have been any more than 18, maybe close to 19, came back from D-Day, from the invasion, and they had to amputate his leg. Well, that was the worst thing. He cried and I cried, because he was this young fellow that just gone overseas and just had been hurt. He had to. It was a very sad time.
Did you find it really remarkable how brave the people?
Most of them, yes.
Most of them were?
Yes, they were. They were.
One of these memoirs talks about a nurse telling about a guy who was having to have an amputation, and he was a little bit afraid, so he sang, and the surgeon sang. So sad, isn't that sad?
Yeah.
They sang throughout the whole procedure, both of them, and it just was something she could never forget. Then how long did you spend at that location? Did you?
Well, from there, I went after a certain period of time. I should have looked these records up. We went back to our unit, and after it was clear in D-Day, we went over to France. I forget just when, how many days after. We went to France, and we were in a staging area until we could go back up further. After Paris was liberated, we went into Paris and worked out of the American hospital there, which was beautiful accommodations.
And I want you to tell about the coincidence that we discovered.
Yes, Dr. Wright was in the unit at
My father. Isn't that amazing?
Paris. And when he came to work here, he knew me right away because I was working in the operating room over here, and he knew me right away, and I knew him naturally.
I couldn't believe it.
Well, did you at least have some fun in Paris?
After a while, yes.
I remember my parents, because my mother volunteered for the Red Cross, and I remember thinking, maybe I'm wrong, that you all were the first hospital unit in Paris after Paris was liberated. Is that right?
Yes.
And they said that the streets were just filled with people who were coming out, embracing all the Americans, and just so grateful for what had happened.
They welcomed the Americans at that time.
Yeah. Okay, so you were in Paris, and after that?
After that, we went up to Belgium, and we set up a hospital there. And I don't have pictures of that hospital, but we set up a hospital there that was bombed, and we lost 17 of our personnel from our own unit that were killed when it was bombed. And then we set up another hospital in Belgium, and that's where we stayed for the remainder of the war.
Was it unusual for bombings to happen?
This was those buzz bombs, which were just launched. They didn't know where they were going to hit. They just launched them, and they hoped that it would hit some strategic place, but unfortunately it hit a hospital.
Oh,
So none of the patients were killed. were hurt even. They were hurt enough when they got there. But the personnel from the hospital were the ones that were killed.
So, in general, hospitals were not intentionally bombed?
No, no. As I say, they just launched these, what they call buzz bombs, in hoping that it would hit some strategic.
Right. Did you, since you had been around this kind of thing for a while by then, at any point did you become sort of immune to being afraid? Were you afraid?
Not really, no. No, I figure we were there to do a job, just like those boys were, and we do it the best we can.
How long were you there altogether? I mean, you seem to be following the course of war.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Then we stayed in Belgium until after the World War was over there, and we were being alerted to come back. I was there during the Battle of the Bulge, and we were alerted after the war was over that we were going to go to the Pacific. And at that time, in Europe, they were saying 2 down, 1 to go, which meant Germany, Italy down, and then they were going for Japan after that.
And then you were alerted you were going to the Pacific?
Yes, but then the war ended in the Pacific, and we were able to come home soon after.
Right. I think it was you who was talking a little bit about prisoners of war that you came in contact with. Was it you, Ann?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, when they'd get the prisoners of war, many of them were young people or old we had at the hospital there, and they would help with various things at the hospital. They were never allowed to work in the kitchen, but they'd work in the operating room washing instruments, or else doing dirty jobs like wringing out plaster when they were putting plaster casts on. And they were very, very happy to be away from their own because they were getting good meals and they had a warm place to sleep, which was more than they were getting at that time from their own units.
Didn't you say that they were actually just surprised and almost just astounded that they were being treated so well?
The Americans treated them so well, yes.
Did they speak English? Any of them?
Some of them. Broken English, yes.
Were there any friendships made? I mean, was it possible to actually, you know, like each other? Yes, we did. They were, as I say, we had a lot of these young fellows that were there that felt the same way about the war as we did. They were there because they had to be, and they had no choice in the matter. Right. Can we ask you the same question?
Yes, well, my career in the Navy, I went to Bethesda. I stayed at Bethesda Naval Hospital, which of course is a very beautiful place. And then I got my orders to a hospital ship. And the name of it was the USS Refuge. And of course, a hospital ship is 2 commands on a ship. The ship's company and the hospital. We had a complete hospital on the ship with doctors, nurses, everything. And the Refuge made 3 round trips to the European theater of war. And when we went, we would take on 400 or 500 patients in, say, 2 days. And one of the times we went to North Africa, then we came back and we went to Naples, and then we went to Belfast, in Belfast. And then while we were in Naples, I have my famous story of all to tell. When I was a student nurse at Georgetown, I had Cardinal Pacelli as a patient. I was a student nurse, and I had him as a patient on, say, Friday PM duty, Saturday and Sunday PM duty, and Monday morning. And his English was about as good as my Italian Latin. My 3 years of Latin in high school came forth. And so anyway, then 6 years later, I'm on a hospital ship. We're in Naples, and he's Pope Pius XII. And so while we were in Naples, we had an opportunity the Red Cross arranged for a group of us from the ship to go to Rome. So we went, and the day we went happened to be the day that the Pope saw the military, and we were all lined up around the edge of this great big room, and he walked around, he looked, he said, "Oh, it's nice to see you." And of course, almost everybody went, because so I said to him, "Well, I'm a Navy nurse now, and I'm on a hospital ship we're in Naples right now." So he looked at me and he said, "I will pray for a safe voyage for your ship." And oh, did I get a ribbing about my ship? Everybody was glad they were on my ship.
It worked.
It worked. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
That was one of the most interesting experiences.
That's very interesting experience. When you went to Naples and to Belfast, did you go all the way back to the United States first?
We went 3 round trips. And we took on, of course, when we took on, say, 500 patients, we evacuated the hospitals from in the area where we were. And many of the biggest thing, when we got the patients, the biggest thing was to get them clean. Many of them hadn't had a good hot soap and water bath for a while, and so that was a primary thing, to get the patients, to get them clean. And we served good food on the ship, and this was the thing. And of course we had all kinds of cases, among 400 people. And then, of course, among 400 people, as soon as the ship left the dock, there were X number of seasick people immediately.
Among the patients?
Yes.
Gee, it wouldn't be bad enough just to be wounded, but to be seasick.
Oh, well, a lot of people, as soon as the ship left the dock, they were seasick. Whether they were or not, they talked themselves into it, I think.
Could you give them anything for seasickness?
Penny.
Now, if you were a person who got seasick a lot, would they still make you work on a ship?
Oh, no. We had a nurse who went from New York to North Africa, and she was in the bed the whole time, and she was flown back to the States, and we got a new one in her place.
Oh, no.
She was sent ashore. She never went to.
Right. Now, were the patients pretty stable by the time they got on your ship?
Oh, no.
No, they weren't.
They were all.
They said the sickest,
yes, they were all different ones.
the sickest ones were sent home.
If they weren't terribly sick, if they were wounded but could still function, would they send them back out into fighting?
No, once they got back to the United States, I don't know what they did. I don't know where they went to the different hospitals, depending upon what was the matter with them.
Right.
But with our units, those that might have just had a piece of shrapnel or they need a little debridement of an area, they went back on duty.
Well, after the three round trips, the ship went to the European theater. Then we were sent to the Pacific.
Oh, you were sent.
We went from New York to New Guinea. In 45 days, I learned to knit. And then the big thing was we crossed the equator. And all the old shellbacks really gave us the business about initiation. We were really initiated properly. And about 2 weeks before, all you could hear was over the loudspeaker was, "Pollywogs beware, pollywogs beware." And there was none of the nurses had been across the equator before. So, they really, I think what we did, we put our bathing suits on under our uniforms because they hosed us down, they stuck us in, The only thing the captain made them promise that they would not chop our hair like they did the fellows. They take it and cut it. And they made believe that they cut the hair, but when I saw black hair, I knew it wasn't mine. But so anyway, we were.
Now, is this your picture?
Yes. Oh, that was they had us dance for them.
This is on the trip, right? When you were crossing the equator?
Yeah, there we are. The one whose hat is falling off is me.
Now, by the way, these 3 photographs are each of these women when they were in the Senate.
That's what I looked like then.
She liked half then, too.
That's right. Different
Now,
time.
what's this picture right here? Is this one of your...
Yes, that's one of the wards. You see, they had, that's one of the nurses, and that's what the wards were.
On the ship?
Yes, that's on the ship.
Are they 2 tiers or 3 or what?
Two, and some of them on the psychiatric ward that was very large ward. They had 3 because all those patients were ambulatory. They had no bed.
Who was in the psychiatric ward?
Psychiatric patients, the patients who came in, you know,
But I
people
mean,
who
what
needed it.
sorts of things were they suffering from?
I really don't know. They came with a diagnosis that they needed psychiatric care, and that's who they were. That I don't know.
Section 8.
Section 8. Well, because we had a psychiatrist. We had a couple of nurses who were specialists who liked that kind of work. I worked on surgery. I never surgical wards. I never.
I see.
Of course, everybody has to do a certain amount of psychiatry.
I was going to say, I mean, who wouldn't need a psychiatrist after being in a war? Really?
But these were psychiatric patients
Yeah.
who were transferred to us. And then when we went to the Pacific, we were among. That's when we really worked. We really worked because we were right among all the ships, and we got patients as they were wounded. We got them right off the ships. And many of the men from the big ships, when they got on the hospital ship, they were scared because the hospital ship was all lit up, and their ships, of course, were dark at night, and they were afraid. A couple of times, they had the hospital ship smoked in, so they couldn't see us.
Would an enemy plane assume that if a ship were very lit up, that it was a hospital ship?
I don't know what they assumed, but we just prayed to God that they would.
Were hospital ships ever bombed?
Oh, yes. I think in Pearl Harbor, the Benevolence was. And but talk about that. And one of the most unforgettable things besides seeing the Pope was we had a kamikaze plane hit a ship near us, and we had several burn patients. And we worked so hard on them. Among the burn patients were 2 men who died, and they were in their from their ship. Their captain said they had requested, and they had for them to be buried at sea. And so I forgot the name of the ship that they were from, but they sent over a unit and they set up everything for this burial at sea. And I tell you, there wasn't that was dry then. And when that young man from the ship came and he sang "Nearer My God to Thee," everybody was, oh, I'll never forget that, never. But I guess it was the end of July or something like that, in 45 when they rotated the original group. They were slowly rotating us, and I came back from Manila, back to the States, and I got home, and VJ Day was the next day I got home. Everybody was out in Sag Harbor running around, and a lot of people didn't know I was home. I stayed in bed for 3 days. I was so exhausted. I didn't care. I said, "Oh, good, thank God."
Oh gosh.
But I didn't go out and celebrate. No, celebration enough to stay home.
Knowing you were alive was a big celebration for you, right?
Oh, that's the story. In World War II. I got out in 46, and St. Patrick's Day, 1946. I came from Boston to New York on the train, and I got off in New York, and they were playing "It's a Great Day for the Irish." I said, "Not half as great as this Polish, I'll tell you." So anyway.
Thank you. Dolores, can you tell us about your time?
Well, I had an interesting experience. I was assigned to a hospital train, and usually when I tell that to somebody, they say training unit, or they don't understand that it really was a train. The train was set up like an entire hospital, and we had on the train there would be administrative officers, there would be doctors, there would be like a chief nurse, there would be staff nurses, and then there would be like, we had 2 shifts, 7 to 7 in the day and 7 to 7 at night. And I was second lieutenant, so on the train, that was like the lowest rank. So I got night duty like permanently, no matter where I would do. I would always get to 7 to 7. But what was bad about it was we were stationed on Miller Field in Staten Island, and our patients would come from Halloran Hospital. So the patients, they would be patients at Halloran Hospital, they'd be checked over, and then there would be about 10, in my unit, 10 nurses. We lived in one of the housing. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, the bus would come and pick us up, and we would go to the trains, which was ice cold, and then they would start loading the patients from Halloran. And the way the patients would be divided, it would be according to their diagnosis. If they had orthopedic problem, they would be going to Walter Reed. If they had TB, they would be going to Colorado. So our train would start out, and we would be headed for California. And then at certain places, it would break off, and then you know, some trains would go south, north. So when we started out, we had like a big complement of staff. And so then when we got to California, it'd be the reverse. Then the people coming in from the Pacific hospitals, they would be put on, and then we would come back. And a couple of things that you asked if things are memorable. I always remember being at night. I'd be on at night, so everybody'd be sleeping. The train would come into these little towns. It'd be like coming into Bridgehampton, you know, like 3 o'clock in the morning, and there might be 20 people, women there, and they would keep this like the station open all night, and we would jump off, and they would give us like bags of cookies. They'd wave at all the people, and some of the patients would be awake, you know, looking out, because the patients were in bunks. And not long ago, I read in the Times where some of the people from North Platte, Nebraska, which was one of the places, and they said that they got cards from many of the people, the patients who were on those hospital trains. And it was quite an exciting assignment, and sometimes we would have POWs. You mentioned POWs. Now, when they would be on, we had German POWs. Then, in addition to the regular staff, so there would be the hospital staff, the nurses, the doctors, so on. Then there would be the regular Army fellows on with guns standing at each of the stations, because they had to be guarded. And then there would be the third set of people, which would be the train people who would be running the train. And the thing that was interesting to me is when I'm on a train now, which is rarely, but when I'm going from car to car, you know, I'm very careful because I'm thinking I'm going to fall. But when you're 23 and you're on, like, you're going from car to car, and half the time those side doors on up, and you never just thought about it at all. And I never thought about like being in danger or having an accident or anything, but actually a couple of people did fall off at times, and had to stop the train. And we had a regular operating room on the train, and we had surgeons and so forth. So that was a...
You had a regular operating room.
It was a regular operating room, treatment rooms, gave medicines, because again, most of these patients were pretty sick, and sometimes you'd have to get the doctor, if somebody really was and they'd have to stop the train, wire ahead, and another Army hospital, the ambulance would come and take them off the train, bring them to the hospital. So that was sort of unusual. At one time, one of the nurses did come to me, and she said, I just can't go in the POW train to give the medicines because my brother was killed in Germany. And she said, would you go for me? And she said, if I have to go, I'll go. Well, I said, no, I would be glad to go. That was a you know, sad time, too.
Now, were the POWs being transported?
I believe they were on their way. There was a big Texas. They were going to one of the bases in Texas.
to work?
Yeah, they worked down there. Yeah, they would give them assignments and so forth.
Wounded?
They were wounded, yeah, they were wounded, but they were going to Texas, and but there were POWs at different camps, because later on, when I was transferred to the Air Corps, there were a lot of POWs at MacDill Field in Florida, and they were working.
Did any of you know any women, any nurses or other women in the service who were taken prisoner?
No.
I didn't know any, but there were nurses on Baton.
Right.
That
Yeah,
were
For 3
prisoners.
years.
I didn't know anybody.
I don't think in Europe there were any were
Right.
taken prisoners.
Were there many times that you could sort of forget about the war, all of you, and have, you know, an enjoyable time in leisure time, or
Oh, sure.
how was that?
Sure.
Sure, when I was in California, one of the nice things is you'd be there for 2 or 3 days. And again, I was a second lieutenant, so I wasn't as smart as some of the other people. We went to one of the hospitals, and the head nurse said, "I'm short." And she looked at me, she said, "I'm short of staff, and I need somebody for night duty." Well, I was so gullible, I would have probably said, "Well, here I am." But instead, the person who was with me, she said to the person, "We're under the New York command, and she said, "You have no authority over us. We're with the hospital train unit. You can't take us." So sometimes we have 2 or 3 days in Hollywood, and that was a fun thing, and they take us to the studios, and I met Eddie Cantor and saw some of the movies being made, so that we did have fun times.
How about?
Well, like for an example, when we were in Naples, I think we were there for almost a week to get supplies, and because you see, we took on about 500 or 600 people, you know, in 2 or 3 days. So we went all over. Saw Naples. We went to Rome, and then you weren't off every day, but you were off a few days.
Right. I think one of you mentioned you spent a lot of time writing letters.
Yes, that was the
Right.
main thing.
Can you show us the little letter forms that you used?
We wrote our letters on these, and they would be transcribed, or what do they call this?
Whatever
I
they
guess
did.
transcribed.
Transcribed into
Email.
this. They call it email.
And then you did you need a stamp?
No, that was free.
Just stuck it in mail.
Yeah.
And how would you get mail? I mean, would you get mail every few days, or
Oh,
would
yes.
you get mail every day, or?
Well, when you got it, you got 5 or 6 at one time. It wouldn't be every day. Maybe once a week it would come in, and you'd get 4, 5, 6, or whatever.
You must have really looked forward to
yes.
getting mail.
But if anybody had time, that was the first thing that they would do, write home.
Right home.
We'd always say to these young kids, write to your mother. You know?
Yeah.
Were any of you did you ever come home on leave in a time and part of your service?
No, I never did.
No. And how many years was that? You were
Nearly 3.
3 years. Yeah.
I was on 40.
One thing you did mention about the letters is that they were all censored.
Yes, they were censored.
When you were in Naples, you couldn't say you were in Naples because that would be all marked
Right.
out.
Now, one of our audience members, who's also an alumni of our Talking History, as of quite a few alumni in this room, but Harry Martin over there, showed me his journal that he kept when he was in the Army. And he had little places cut out of his journal, right?
Yeah.
Out of...
I had a separate service diary.
That was smart.
Harry kept a diary all throughout his years in the service.
I wish I had.
I wish I had also.
Penny,
I want to mention that Harry's going to be a guest here in the 3rd evening of this World War II series, and it's on February 27th, so we'll hear more from him then.
All I'm standing. The local VFW, we have 2 life member nurses that belong to the 709. One of them is Jean Squire's daughter, Grace Ireland by Hagen, and other people know Grace Squire. She's a sister to Phyllis Heft. There's another one named Una Merkel. Those 2 ladies are members of the VFW.
Of the local VFW.
Now, if I had known that you wanted some you know, Army nurses, I could
Yeah.
talk to them.
We didn't start off trying to get, you know, all nurses, but we had, well, it sort of happened this way, and we were very happy to have all of you. It would be wonderful to do another program sometime with, you know, people from other branches of the service, and I understand there's someone in this room, Mary Shader?
Right here.
Is that you?
Yes.
Were you in the service during the war?
Oh, yes.
Were you a nurse, or were you?
No, I was WAC.
You were a
I
WAC?
was Army Corps.
Were you really? And where were you?
Well, I landed at Prestwick, Scotland. I was flown over. I was one of the lucky ones there. And then I went to London, and then from there I went to Normandy, and from Normandy to Paris. I was there 14 months.
Oh, were you really? So we'll think about trying to get in touch. Maybe I can get your telephone number later. We're also going to have a program down the line with, we hope, with a couple of prisoners of war. And we've also heard about a couple of people who were survivors of the Holocaust. So we'll try to do that too, because this is just where.
Penny, you asked before if any of us had any funny experiences, and Bessie had her Pope story, which I think is wonderful. But when I was at MacDill Field, again, night duty, working in maternity, and all of a sudden we filled up and we didn't have any room, and so I looked around, somebody's got to go home. So who do I find? But it's the general's wife is the one that go home. So I had to call him at 2 o'clock in the morning and just tell him the situation. And I remember that all the doctors said, oh, call the general. They weren't going to call him. I had to call him. But anyway, I called him, the head of MacDill Field, and I said, we're short, we need the bed. He said, I'll be right there. So I always remember that as an interesting story.
Right, that's great. That's great. We don't have much longer. Let's just open it up a little bit to a few questions, and then I want to have you show us a few of the things that you brought also. But is there anybody who has a question?
What about supplies? Did you ladies always have the supplies you wanted to work with? Did you have to improvise? How were your supplies?
On the ship, we were very good. We were well supplied.
I think we were also.
Did you get good food?
Yes, on the ship, yes, we did.
Somebody did.
Yes, one of the nurses on the ship met a friend of hers, a classmate of hers in Naples, and she was working in she was an Army nurse, and she was working in this hospital, and she met her when we evacuated the hospital, and we invited her and 2 or 3 of her friends over for dinner, and they walked in, and here they saw this beautiful white linen tablecloth and napkins and all this stuff, and they stood there and they just cried.
That's what I had.
I never saw that.
No, nor I.
I think it was you, Dolores, who mentioned, I was going to ask you, I think you mentioned something about how did being in the war prepare you for later nursing? Can you answer that?
Well, I just quickly think it gave us a lot of self-confidence. We felt very good about ourselves. Even though I had graduated from a small school, Southampton Hospital was a small school compared to Presbyterian, Bellevue, and so forth. But I never felt that I was inadequate. We just felt very confident. And somebody would tell you to do something, you know, tomorrow night you're going to be the night supervisor. You know, say, oh, that's good. I'll be the night supervisor. You know, and if you have maybe somebody with you for 2 nights, then you'd be on your own. So I think it prepared us very well for civilian life.
Well, you see, with me, it wasn't too different because I was working at Georgetown for 4 years. Then I went into service for 42 months. And then when I got out, I went to work at Columbia Presbyterian for practically 5 years.
Were your attitudes changed? I mean, did you feel very different after that experience?
No.
All of you?
Not me. I don't think I did.
Not really.
No. As I say, we were still doing the work of our choice. We would have been doing pretty much the same thing if we were in civilian life.
Did any of you know nurses who then decided to go to medical school? I mean, did that happen fairly often?
I don't know that, but I don't know. But many of the men who were corpsmen went into medical school and became doctors and whatever, dentists and whatever.
So in a way, it sounds like you felt your readjustment was fairly smooth, was it?
Yes,
It was for me.
In terms of the care that you had to give to these wounded men, probably so quickly and so intensively, did you see like advances in medical technology or in the practice of medicine or nursing that changed things?
Not
surgery.
Not in that period of time. Since then, there's been big advancement.
But
They didn't learn anything new in dealing with all these wounded men?
oh, I guess I imagine everybody. One thing you learned how to take care of, clean, and bath a person and clean them and you make them comfortable. That was a big thing when we had all these patients. And
Those soldiers had a hard time washing in the helmet.
Sure. And they just, of course, they thought the nurses who were in their white uniforms that we were somebody special.
Well, yeah.
You must have gotten a lot of attention, I'm sure.
They were very respectful.
Very.
They were very respectful to the nurses.
Whose uniform is this?
Mine.
That was your uniform. Isn't that amazing? Did you have many uniforms for different occasions? Or was
Yes. Yeah, we had fatigues that we'd wear. We had whites.
Brown underwear?
Did you?
No, we never were issued the brown underwear. I don't know why. I feel cheated because I don't. And believe me, we could have used it sometime.
What do the ribbons designate? Where you were?
Different battles that we were involved in.
Now, if you were living in tents and these bad conditions, I mean, you probably didn't wash your uniform very much, did you?
No.
Okay.
Our hospital, second hospital, was set up in what they called the Citadel in Belgium, in Liège, and there are pictures here of it, of when it was a military school, I think. And the hospital, the Army took it over and we set up hospital there.
Now,
Practical standpoint, how were your uniforms and your clothes taken care of?
Well, we took care of our own personal things, but they had a laundry that would do, they had seersucker uniforms overseas, so they were very easy for them to launder them, and we didn't have to worry about that. As I say, we took care of our own personal.
Yeah, we did. We did too.
I'm glad you held that one uniform up, and I was terribly curious.
yes, let's see the other uniforms.
Here. Oh, that's it.
Yes, we wore
You can put it on if you want.
we wore brown seersucker dresses and then the cape.
Yeah.
And believe it, it's heavy. It's very
Very
heavy.
sturdy.
And then this was my, see, I was in the States, so Anne was really in the combat zone, but I was in the States, so this was my overcoat that I would wear. You know, a dress overcoat, yeah.
Yes, right. Man's
Yeah. And this was our hat.
Yeah, let's see the hat.
See, that was the outfit for that. And then we had all kinds of different uniforms because I was in the States, so this would be another dress.
That I wore with that uniform.
Yeah. And then we carried identification cards with a red cross so that if we were captured or prisoners, that would identify us as a medical person.
Did you just say you were, was it the Air Force?
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, after you just get orders one day, and you're transferred to the Air Force. So I was at the station hospitals of the 3rd and the 15th Air Force in the United States, though.
You got out of the Army, is that it?
What's that? Yeah, actually, when I got out, I actually was in the Air Corps.
Oh, in the
Yeah.
You know, we just learned tonight of the death of someone who was a nurse.
Navy nurse.
A Navy nurse. What was her name? Because I think it would be nice to mention that.
Yes. This was my mess kit that was issued to me when I went overseas. And the interesting thing about it, it was a recycled from the First World War. And it's AEF from 1918 to 1919.
Can we hold it up for the camera here? Look at that. Would you cook in this?
No, they would service our meal, would stand on chow line and they'd just slop it in there. But I think the fact that it's from the First World War is interesting.
Is that your canteen, Ann?
Yes, there's a canteen.
See, where's the canteen?
Right here.
Oh, there we go.
And we had a canteen, a far cry from the water, far cry from the water that they have today.
She wears it sometimes.
Did they put chlorine in the water?
Yes, yes, it was all chlorine.
Did it have a bad taste?
Yes.
You got used
When
to
it was the only thing you could get.
Right.
Yeah. There's the canteen.
Can we pass this around?
Of course.
This looks pretty sturdy.
Where do you wear your uniform?
We can pass this around too.
The last time I wore a uniform was several years ago when I marched in the parade in Sag Harbor, and all I could hear, "My God, that's Betsy!" When I marched the parade, the last time I was marched in uniform in Sag Harbor.
Believe me, we all envied her that she could still get it.
She was still wear a uniform, right? You can say that.
We drank water out of a Lister bag.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, the Lister bags that we used to draw.
Yeah, that's it.
Are there any other veterans, by the way, in this room? I mean, John Holden is a veteran. Are there any others? Because
There's one standing in the doorway, not of World War II. But
I was in the Air Force.
Oh, were you really?
and she was a crew chief.
I worked on the KC-135. We refueled other things.
Oh, my goodness.
This was the Stars and Stripes that was put out peace in
Yeah,
In,
we used to get those.
What's the date?
August 14th, 1945. It's a Tuesday.
Stars and stripes.
Well, on that note, I think we'll thank all of the three of you and those of you in the audience for being here as well. It was a very interesting and wonderful time that you've given us. Thank you so much for sharing the memories. You mean to tell me this is real on TV?
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much. My biggest thing is, if anybody tells a war story, I always have one better.
Well, Betsy, I don't know if you didn't mention it, but she went back in the service. She was called back
Yes,
to the Korean War.
right.
She's a Korea Navy nurse, but 22 years in.
That's what I was wondering. I heard you say that you were in 22 years.
Yeah.
I was called back during the Korean War. I was recalled to active duty.
Did you go overseas then?
Oh, yes.
That's for another talking history.
That's for another time.
Why don't you come across the hall and have something to eat?
I said this was
Chat with these
World
folks.
War II, and I'm going to cut it off at World War II.
Thanks again.